Hello and welcome to the UK Forum on a Multipolar World. Today I'm talking with Sir Nick Harvey, CEO of European Movement UK, former Minister, Member of Parliament and CEO of the Liberal Democrats. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to get straight in, and the first question I'm going to ask is, could you just explain what the European Movement UK is and what it does?
So the European movement was formed in the aftermath of World War II, where the post-war European leaders came together and said, we've had 2 wars in 3 decades. We must work together now to put an end to this forever. And the European movement was formed to bring peace and harmony between the peoples and nations of Europe. It was born at the Congress of Europe in The Hague in 1948. The British chapter, which is European Movement UK, was formed in the House of Commons the following year with all the party leaders, Churchill at the forefront of this, forming the European movement. We spent the first 25 years of our life working quietly behind the scenes to get the UK into the EEC, which happened in 1973. When there was the first referendum on European membership in 1975, we ran the In campaign. I think then, without wishing to sound critical of my forefathers, they perhaps thought job was done and didn't think the argument was going to have to be made all over again, and began to turn themselves slightly into a bit of a wine and cheese society celebrating European culture, so much so that when 2016 and the referendum came, we really weren't big enough to run the campaign then. And in the aftermath of the outcome of 2016 and the failure to achieve the people's vote in 2019, the European Movement UK was at a bit of a low ebb with just a few hundred members. But since that time, we have steadily rebuilt and regrown. We now have 27,500 members, 300,000 supporters, staff of approximately 24, and branches up and down the UK. And our long-term aim is to get the UK back to the heart of Europe as a member of the EU, but we accept that that's not something which can be achieved overnight or really in a hurry at all. So we are concentrating on a step-by-step approach, but very much with that long-term goal in our mind.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting history. Second question I want to ask is, the UK is now potentially in an unprecedented position in terms of its own global position, its own defence and security. Why do you think the UK's relationship with the EU is important for the UK's defence and security? And what is it that is the most important aspect of this relationship in terms of defence and security?
I think it's clear that we're now living in a much more volatile and dangerous world that both we and our European neighbours all through the continent face challenges that are more serious than we have for a very long time. The defence relationship between Europe and the US, which has existed since the end of the Second World War, now has question marks over it in a way it really never has before. It's always been the underlying assumption of all of Europe's defence that when push came to shove, ultimately the Americans were there as the guarantors of our security. Now, Donald Trump's return to the White House has really changed all that. But in truth, if you look harder, these changes in the US have been taking place over a very long period of time. And successive American presidents, dating right back to Kennedy, have argued that Europe should do more in its own defence. We've rather turned a deaf ear to that. And European defence, but particularly British defence, has grown up over the decades with a degree of interdependency with the US military. Now, questions have been raised by Trump about NATO, about that relationship, And even if Trump goes in 3 years' time and is replaced by a more conventional US president, frankly, doubts have been cast that can never be undone. Questions have been asked that can never be unasked. And it's causing everybody in Europe to think again. And in a sense, Trump and Putin are driving European unity in a way neither of them intends. And the UK is very much geographically, culturally, historically, and militarily part of that. And I applaud Keir Starmer for having made it absolutely clear from the outset that we saw ourselves as part of the European defence equation. And as things go forward from here, Europe must get its act together. If you look at the population of Europe, if you look at the GDP of the European economies, if you look at the numbers of uniformed service personnel we have in Europe, this should be more than enough to protect our collective security, more than enough to deal with the Russians, more than enough to have a peacekeeping role in a post-war Ukraine. But the reason that it isn't is simply that it hasn't been sufficiently coordinated. All the different European member states have pursued their own policies, their own priorities. And what we end up with then are armed forces that are not planned as a whole. There is duplication, there is waste, there are strategic gaps which are going to take some years to fill. And it's essential that we do now wake up, smell the coffee, get our act together, and work together as a continent to guarantee our own security and to punch our weight in global terms, where collectively we are big players, but possibly haven't yet found a way of projecting that.
Thank you very much. And I think you covered a lot of the subjects there that I will return to and wanted to talk about in this interview. And I just wanted to bring it now to the UK-EU Security and Defence Partnership that was signed in May 2025. I just wondered if you could talk about maybe some of the benefits that we've seen come out of this agreement, some of the progress that's been made through it, and maybe some of the barriers to further progress that still exist between the UK and the EU and the limitations of the agreement.
I mean, I think that the UK's relationship with Europe in the most broad sense was obviously fractured by the UK leaving the European Union and the years of argument and wrangling that preceded that. This resulted in a loss of trust, probably both ways, across the channel. I think our European colleagues understand that in relative terms, the UK remains quite a significant defence force, and I think they very much welcome the willingness on the part of the UK to chip in and count ourselves part of the defence of Europe going forwards. But it is important that that relationship is not entirely ad hoc, that it isn't something that just ebbs and flows with the passing tides. It's something that needs to be planned, that needs to be strategic. And I think that the agreement that was reached at the first EU-UK summit in 2025 was essentially a statement of intent. There wasn't a huge amount of substance to it, but it was signalling a clear direction of travel. I mean, European defence structures themselves are quite interesting. There is a veritable alphabet soup of different EU defence initiatives, each and every one of which makes sense in and of itself. But when you look at the whole, it's a bit like a bowl of spaghetti and slightly hard to make much sense of. So my own view is that we need to have either a European defence union, a practical operational defence entity across the whole of Europe, or at the very least that we have some sort of a European Security Council. So, I mean, the former is slightly more on the NATO model, the latter is slightly more on the UN model. I would favour the former. I think we need a practical and operational way of linking up that would then give some structure and strategy to all this panoply of organizations that are there. So there's a very long way to go. And at the same time as signing that partnership with the EU, you've seen the UK out improving bilateral partnerships with, I mean, we already have a strong bilateral partnership with France, but we've seen new arrangements with Germany, with Poland, with Spain. These are all important too, because despite what I'm saying about the need for Europe-wide defence and security structures, the fact remains, and it will do for the foreseeable future, that a lot of the decision-making lies at nation-state level. So it's important to be building up these bilateral relations at the same time as trying to help Europe-wide institutions to find their feet and get up and running. We've got separate dialogues with some of the northern states, the Baltics, the Scandinavian countries, where we have concerns about the Arctic and the far north. We can see that relationship also playing into the Greenland issue. Iceland, Canada, all interested parties in this as well. So there's a lot going on out there. It's quite a complex picture. The partnership agreement we signed with the EU in 2025 is not comprehensive. It's not all-encompassing. It doesn't bring all of that together as yet in any meaningful organizational sense, but it's a first statement of intent, which is a sort of route map to something more comprehensive to follow.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. You absolutely preempted my next question then, which was going to be about the actual practicalities of implementing this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that while I'm emphasizing to you that the relationship with America will never be quite the same again, and it really won't, I think it's also very important not to turn our backs on America, to make it clear that we do still have a broadly fairly empathetic world view with them, and not to sort of let them off the hook of thinking that we've turned our back on them and that they can walk away, because I think there will still be a lot of scope for cooperation with the Americans going forward. So when I'm talking to you about a European Defence Union, I mean, I see this as being a pillar within NATO. At least that's what I would like to see, and that's why I would hope that the Americans don't rupture NATO and walk away from it altogether. However, the countries of Europe within what I'm calling a European Defence Union really need to have a sufficiently comprehensive set of capabilities that when they feel the need to act together in circumstances where the Americans aren't really inclined to get involved, that we've got the ability to do that. And the reality is, at the moment, we do not have that. And I mean, there has been talk about the European countries taking on a role in a post-war Ukraine of trying to help protect the peace line wherever it might be. But the reality is that for at least, I would have thought, a decade, we're very reliant on the Americans for satellite imagery and intelligence, for supply chain logistics. We need to backfill these strategic gaps and to get on with it. So I think that's my vision, is that there is a practical, operational European entity that will bring together a European effort, but I would prefer not to see it as a rival to NATO, but an important part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, taking a step back from the issue of defence specifically, I think it's fair to say that we're seeing a world now that's really turning away from the multilateralism that the EU embodies. Do you think that gives the EU an advantage on the global stage or a disadvantage? And do you think that the UK being part of the EU gives the UK itself an advantage or disadvantage in this global context?
I mean, you're quite right. The world is changing, and it's changing fast. And I suppose if we just cast our minds back as little as 20 years to the sort of dawning of the era of globalism, we can see that even in that short period of time, power and influence in the world is very much moving from a world of 200 nation states towards one of half a dozen or so blocs. To some extent, they can overlap on certain issues. They're not absolutely rigid rival blocs, but nevertheless, I mean, there are these big, powerful blocs forming, and it's important for the 46, 7, 8 countries of Europe, if we want to thrive in a world that's changing that fast, that we get our act together and use our collective scale to compete in such a world. So we're at a slight disadvantage in terms of the starting position. I mean, the 50 states of the US are much better coordinated than the 47 or 8 states of Europe, which have each got centuries of tradition. But the challenge is to get ourselves as powerfully united as we can in order to achieve the muscle and the might to show broad shoulders in this competitive world. And when we look at some of the great issues of our age, climate change, mass migration of peoples on account of poverty, famine, disease, and so on, individually, the countries of Europe may not be able to do very much, but collectively, we really can. The countries of Europe together are the world's largest international aid donor, so we can really affect the issues that are driving mass migration. We can tackle the security issues that we've just been talking about. We can tackle cybercrime. We can stand up to the big multinational tech companies that almost seem to view the globe as a wild west where might delivers all. So it's potentially going to be a very good scenario if we get our act together, because there is a framework there through the EU. We need to be back in there. Europe is potentially a powerful player in this new world. Britain on its own is not, but Britain in Europe had a natural leadership role before as one of the big three forces in Europe. We are very much missed by some of the countries that look at the world in a similar way to how we do. And I think when we go back in, while we must go back in with a degree of humility and not just expecting as of right to be one of the big cheeses again, if we play our cards right, we will in time get to exercise a big role in the European community of nations again. And that is the best way for Britain to project our national interests on a global scale.
Thank you very much. And I want to maybe dig into that a little bit more. And I think this relates to a lot of what you've just said. We've definitely seen in recent years, maybe recent decades, the definition of security changing from something which is more about military power and broadening to things like supply chains, economic relationships, international development. What has been your personal perspective on that change during the time when you were a minister, but subsequently the work you've done? How have you seen the nature of security change, and particularly from the UK's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review that the British government conducted, and I was involved in that in a significant way, we were very conscious then that the security threat was beginning to change We were very, very much aware of the threat of cyber attack and cyber terrorism. We were very much aware of the shifting sands in terms of economic power and economic crime. And if you read that review, I mean, even then we were acknowledging that the challenge was changing significantly, and that's only accelerated and grown greater since. There's nothing in the sense that anyone can do about this. This is the way of the world that we live in, and why it's so important for a relatively small island nation, but still one of the world's largest economies. If we want to thrive in this challenging security picture, we need to work with our allies. Now, predominantly, those are our immediate neighbours, but not exclusively so. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, to name but a few, are beyond the European continent, but broadly have very similar worldviews, very similar economies, democracies to ourselves. So we also need to find ways of working with them to everybody's mutual interests, because the way the Chinese look at the world, the way the Russians look at the world, the way some of the emerging economies look at the world is not the same as ours, and its strength through collective action, economically, yes, in many, many different ways, but that's the way we're going to look after ourselves and prosper and flourish in this changing environment.
Thank you very much. And I think that brings me to the current government and the current situation the government's in terms of defence and security. I was just wondering what you thought the Defence Minister and Armed Forces Minister's resignations recently said about the UK's current situation in terms of defence, and where you think maybe the government is going wrong or what it's done right in terms of defence and security.
So the rupture that we have seen with the Defence Secretary and Armed Forces Minister leaving is a tension that has been building up for decades. I would say this has been building up since the end of the Cold War. And successive defence secretaries of multiple political persuasions have tried and tried and tried to persuade the Treasury and to persuade their fellow ministers in other government departments that we were underfunding defence. And we, I say this collectively, we have not succeeded in persuading political colleagues of that case for 45 years. And this is a moment that has been coming for a long time. In this Parliament, the scale of the defence challenge has become more evident. The European countries have agreed with Donald Trump that we must increase defence expenditure, but this is at a time when we and all European governments are still facing terrible cash problems. You know, we've never really got over the 2008 global financial crisis. Nobody's really found the successful formula for getting economies back on track. This is why incumbent governments of right, left or centre throughout the democratic world have found it a real struggle to get re-elected, because the cost of living, the economic difficulties continue to bedevil all of us. So in terms of our current Labour government in the UK, they inherited a dreadful inheritance from the Conservatives. Public finances in a parlous state, the economy on the floor, public services broken after 14 years of austerity. It was always going to be an absolutely immense challenge. Now, undoubtedly, they have made mistakes they were outfoxed in the pre-election period by Jeremy Hunt, who steered through Parliament some catastrophic and ill-judged national insurance cuts, which he knew perfectly damn well the Exchequer could not afford, and then boxed the Labour opposition into saying that if they won the 2024 election, they would not increase income tax, they would not reverse these national insurance cuts that should never have been made, they would not increase VAT, which meant that when they got into office and inherited this completely parlous state that I've described to you, they left themselves almost nowhere to go in terms of trying to raise more money. I mean, there were sort of basically three options open to them. One was to tax more, one was to borrow more, and one was to set a clear course back into the European market, which would have been about the only way we could have achieved some growth. They ruled out all three, which made it even more difficult. They then decided that they did want to increase public expenditure and tax revenues. So they did this by loading cost onto employers and onto industry, just at a time when they were saying growth was absolutely vital. But these were all measures that were not helpful to economic growth. And unfortunately, recovery has been sluggish and slow, and it's not been helped by Donald Trump arriving on the scene and first all his nonsensical tariff wars, and then the utterly stupid invasion of Iran. And this has held everybody back. So I think the Labour government have made mistakes. I understand where John Healey and Al Khan's were coming from. What they had managed to get out of the Treasury and out of their political colleagues was just the same parsimonious and totally inadequate sort of funding that governments since the 1980s have been presiding over. And it just didn't seem to me to understand or appreciate the gravity of the situation or the urgency of the need to ramp up what we're doing. Our armed forces are very, very thinly spread now, and we need to do something about it urgently.
So you mentioned there that a closer relationship with Europe would have been one way that the government could look to ameliorate its position. And we've heard over the last 12 months, especially, a lot of signalling on the UK potentially pursuing a closer relationship with Europe. We saw after the local elections in Keir Starmer's reset speech, him signalling that he would be seeking a closer relationship with Europe potentially. But we've not really seen much concretely come out of these signals. Why do you think this is? And why do you think the government is not being bolder on Europe? What do you hear from inside the government in terms of this?
So I think the government has been operating with its hands tied behind its back because of the red lines it imposed upon itself at the outset of the 5-year mandate. So they said they would not seek to rejoin the customs union or the single market or restore freedom of movement, let alone begin a process of trying to get back into the European Union itself. So they made life vastly harder for themselves by putting themselves into this straitjacket. But putting that to one side, they then, I think, have done very good work at sending positive signals to the European Union, trying to rebuild trust, looking for practical and pragmatic ways to try and improve the political and the trading relationship with Europe. I thought that the summit in London in 2025 achieved more than I expected it to, and I very much welcomed that. And I think in the last 6 to 9 months, the rhetoric from Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and Nick Thomas-Symonds, the minister responsible for the European relationship, has got considerably warmer and more positive. They are clearly working well on some fairly small contained issues, but I think each time the public see success of that sort, it does slightly more normalise the European issue and put things back into a healthier place. There is no quick way back, but I think what I would say to you is that after the referendum in June 2016 delivered its shock and indeed shocking outcome, investment in the UK started falling off pretty well immediately. The economic damage, which is now estimated at being between 6 and 8% of GDP, hasn't all happened since we actually left in 2020. A lot of it was already beginning to happen in those 4 years running up to that. If they were to send a much more positive signal now, I think the same thing would begin to happen in reverse, that if it was clear that the UK was on a pathway back to the heart of Europe, this would begin to have an economic dividend straight away. I mean, perhaps not transformative, but I think significant and appreciable. Even if you accept that they're not going to get us back into the single market and the customs union in this parliament, it would be quite helpful if they were to start signalling that this would be something they would be looking to do in the future, because I think that that would land very well with our European colleagues. The EU has an understandable distaste for what they call cherry picking, and you can understand why, because if we are able to take the single market a la carte on a big scale, then other European member states who don't like aspects of it will start saying, oh, well, hang on, we would quite like to dine at the single market a la carte, please. And then there would be a risk that the integrity of the market itself would begin to crumble and fall apart. So I think the difficulty with their current strategy is that it's working quite well, but there's a limit to how much more of these sector by sector cherry picking initiatives they can probably find agreement over them. Probably, I think there's probably enough for another round of it, but I think there is a limit to what that pathway can achieve. And what I would very much welcome would be if all political parties, but I suppose realistically I'm talking about the progressive political parties, would say ahead of the 2029 general election that if we are part of the government in the next parliament, we will begin an accession process. That will take years to achieve, but if they were to apply to join the EU and open the process, start negotiating to see what sort of terms could be achieved, the actual decision would be further down the line, but it would be an enormously positive signal to the global economy that we were on a route back in, and I think that would begin to deliver benefit straight away. So I accept that, we're still 3 years from that election, but if the Labour Party recovers a bit politically and either can win the next election itself, or in conjunction with Liberal Democrats and other progressive parties might be in a position to form a government afterwards, they'll need to negotiate a proportional representation and the opening of an accession process with the EU, which will be exploratory in nature to begin with, to see what sort of terms could be achieved, and then ultimately we'll need the consent of the British people once it's clear what it's going to look like. So that's really our objective in the next 2 or 3 years, is to just nudge and cajole and persuade the progressive parties to to commit to opening a process in the next Parliament. If by any glorious chance the Conservative Party were to come to their senses and do so too, that would be brilliant, because we could then turn around to Europe with a very united front. But I have a feeling the Conservatives need at least one more bloody defeat before they will return to their historic position as a proud European force.